Welcome to the Kick the Habit Forever podcast. My name is Michael Quirk. I'm a licensed therapist, coach, and educator. I've spent the last 25 years working with high-performing men, helping them to break free of the addictions, compulsion, bad habits, painful symptoms, and skills deficits that hold them back. If you're a high-performing man and your goal is to get control over your porn use, then this podcast is for you. So welcome. Thanks for watching and listening today. I want to talk with you about the importance of understanding relapse as a predictable cyclical process. Relapse of any kind often happens gradually. In fact, it usually does. And it can be broken down into three very predictable stages. And each stage has its own unique risks to your recovery. Let's talk about the first stage. And traditionally, that's been referred to as what we call emotional relapse. And I want to tell you a little bit about a few of the characteristics of the emotional relapse stage so that you can hopefully predict them and identify themselves in yourself. An important characteristic of the emotional relapse stage is denial. Now, you might find yourself thinking things like, you're not an addict, or this is easy, this is simple. There's a great parallel. Some of my clients who are involved in 12-step recovery programs describe this as the pink cloud. They just feel like they're on top of the world. They feel a sense of joy and relief and comfort and ease because they've stopped using for a little bit of time. And they just have the sense that it's all going to be much, much easier than they think it is. So at this stage, you're not actively thinking about using, but what's going on is you're probably showing poor self-care habits. And some signs of poor self-care habits are things that, like, you're bottling up your emotions. You're isolating from other people. So that could be that you're avoiding your support systems, you're avoiding meetings and therapy, or perhaps you're physically attending, you're showing up in body, but not emotionally and not mentally. So you could be hiding, avoiding engaging, avoiding sharing, avoiding doing the practical work of recovery. At this stage, you might find that your attention is focused on other people instead of yourself. So you might be thinking about their problems. You might be brainstorming ways that it could help them. You might be seeing their blind spots, or you might be very focused on how their behavior is affecting you. Now, at this stage of recovery, usually you're not having a lot of fun and enjoyment. So that aspect of self-care has gone out the window. You might be finding that you're just not eating well. You're not sleeping well. And again, I'm just going to jump back to, there's a lot of wisdom in the 12-step movements. And I sometimes I love to share some of the tips, again, that are given to me by my clients who are very involved in 12-step recovery. They use a word called HALT. It's an acronym, and it stands for hungry, angry, lonely, or tired. These being risk elements for emotional relapse. So in the emotional relapse stage, what's happening is you're becoming increasingly uncomfortable. This can build tension and create a strong desire in you for escape. when that desire for escape builds, then what happens is we will move into what's referred to as mental relapse. And here are some characteristics about this stage. First of all, it's a little bit different because in stage one, it doesn't feel like you're in a conflict or a struggle. Remember, at the surface level of your mind, you're feeling pretty okay. You might even be feeling like recovery is easy, breaking the habit is pretty simple and straightforward and no big deal. You might be feeling very confident about recovery. Uh, but in this stage, that starts to get a little bit more shaky. So that's where there's an inner struggle or an inner conflict that shows up. And some signs of this inner conflict include having conscious thoughts about using, having cravings. So you might be thinking a lot about the topic of your use. You might be picturing it in your mind. Another key symptom or indicator is you start to have fond memories of your past use. So some of my clients, when they're in this stage, they start romanticizing their past use. They start talking with me about how much fun it was, how much enjoyment they had, how much pleasure their use brought them. And they start minimizing the consequences of their past use, right? So they overlook the trouble that the addiction, the compulsion, the bad habit was causing. What also happens at this stage is what we call bargaining. And an example of this it comes from somebody that I had a session with the other day. And she's recovering from, well, let me say this. She has been working on reducing her alcohol use for really years at this point. She'll go through phases where she's not drinking at all, and that will last, a few weeks, a month, maybe 2 months at the top. And then the bargaining kicks in. And she starts saying things to me like she's going to use on vacation and then she's going to stop. So, for example, recently she's talking about how she was adjusting her goal instead of abstaining from alcohol use entirely. What she decided she was going to do was that she was just going to not self-medicate with alcohol. So she wasn't going to drink when she was upset and she wanted to feel calmer. She wasn't going to drink when she was stressed out or angry or sad. Again, she wasn't going to self-medicate painful feeling. Instead, she was just going to drink when she just wanted to have fun. And in this case, she's talking about a girls' trip where she's planning to have fun. And she's discussing with me how she wasn't going to drink because she was angry or scared or upset about the different circumstances in her life. It was more that she just wanted to have a good time and that she deserved it. So another key indicator at this sign is that you start developing control schemes. And these are plans about how you're going to manage your use. And at the same time, you're probably going to find yourself looking for opportunities to use, actively planning your relapse. Again, trying to come up with a way to navigate so that you can use with the least harm that's possible. At this stage of the game, what is key is your ability to recognize high situation. Pardon me. At this stage of the game, what's key is your ability to recognize high risk situations. That's where the slippery part arises at this stage. In stage one, what's key is trying to notice and be aware of how much your self-care is slipping. But at this stage of the game, it's about really having a clear-eyed and sober recognition of just how slippery the situations are. Now, if you don't catch this, then what happens is you move into the next stage, which we call physical relapse. And here are some characteristics of the physical relapse stage. This often occurs when someone believes that they won't get caught. Nobody's going to find out. Their therapist, accountability partner, their sponsor, if they're involved in a 12-step group, they can keep it from everybody. Physical relapse marks the point of actual behavioral relapse. So whatever the addiction is, if it's pornography consumption, you start watching porn again. You start using it. If it's weed, you start vaping or pop a few gummies. If it's drinking, you have a drink. I think you get the point. So let's talk now about some important tools for your recovery. Recovery is a process of personal growth, and there are milestones along the way. And there are two main tools that are really essential, and those include relaxation techniques. I've been talking about how self-care is vital for stage one, and that's because it helps manage your stress and it helps prevent you from becoming emotionally overloaded. A way to think about this is you really don't want your emotional brain to be short circuiting at this point. So, what does that involve? That involves calming your body down and being aware of the thoughts and images that go through your mind. So, you want to address any negative, distorted thinking patterns and build healthier thought process, one that doesn't fuel addiction. And, if you've been in therapy, depending upon the modality that you've worked with, there are different terms for that. Clinically, so for example, in CBT, that's referred to as working with your automatic thoughts and your core beliefs. Those that way of thinking that's habitual and on autopilot for you. In a modality like internal family systems, we refer to this as unblending from your parts, right? In ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy, this is referred to as diffusion, in which you're looking at your thoughts rather than through them, right? So again, what's key is calming the body down and finding a way to disidentify from the thoughts, the feelings, and the cravings to make sure that they're not running you. Let's talk about some early warning signs. The goal is to recognize your early warning signs of relapse. And from working with a lot of people over more than 25 years at this point, I would say big sign is poor self-care. You might find yourself bottling up your own thoughts, feelings. You might find yourself avoiding people. Or when it comes to your thoughts and feelings, you might even find yourself compulsively distracting yourself from as a way to try to keep yourself feeling as calm and comfortable as possible. Secrecy and isolation are important warning signs. Addiction happens in secrecy and isolation. You also are probably going to find yourself slipping into what I call thought traps. And here, what I mean is things like all or nothing thinking, catastrophizing, jumping to conclusions, self labeling. And I want to talk with you now. Start again. Now I'd like to talk to you. Start one more time. Now I'd like to talk with you about some very common negative thoughts and beliefs that are important to address. These are themes that I hear from the men and the women in my practice over and over and over again. I hear them every day when it comes to relapse on drugs, alcohol, porn, sex addiction, gambling, overeating, Instagram addiction, you name it. The themes are very similar. The first one is blame, blaming yourself or other people. So, what that sounds like in your head is, well, my problem is because of so and so. That's why I use. And if so and so weren't happening, or such and such of a circumstance weren't occurring in my life, then I wouldn't be using. So, blame of self, blame of others. You're holding somebody, yourself, another person, or a circumstance is responsible. That's what has all the power over your use. So in effect, you're kind of a slave to that circumstance, right? Because you're always compelled to use until that person changes or the circumstance somehow gets fixed. The next thing that I hear is that people don't believe that they can handle life without using. They think that it's just too difficult. They think that it is not possible, that life is too difficult. Their emotions are too strong. They are too afraid of dealing with their thoughts and feelings. And they fundamentally feel helpless over them. And they believe that they are. They don't even question that. The next theme that gets in people's way, and again, this is very repetitive, they start bargaining. They start coming up with control schemes for their use. And they start thinking that maybe they can just use occasionally, right? So be on the lookout for that. Really stay aware of how you tell yourself that maybe you can just use occasionally. Now, here's where this gets tricky. And there is a school of drug abuse treatment that's been popular for the last 25 years, and that's referred to as harm reduction. And the truth is that we know that there are people that can occasionally use. I've seen that in my practice. I've seen people, but the tricky part is it's incredibly hard to predict if that's going to be you or not. And I can't tell you the numbers of men and women that have spent years going around and around and around the cycle of trying to control their use. And sometimes what happens is they get quite upset and they'll say, well, why didn't you just tell me? Why did you just get in my face and tell me that, and say to me, you're not a person who can use, just get it through your head. Well, the truth is, I'm a human being. I don't have a crystal ball and I don't have X-ray vision. And I have found it very difficult to predict, except to say this. If you've attempted a few times to really manage your use and you haven't been successful, then you really might consider cutting your losses at this point and just making peace with the fact that you may not be a person who can control your use. So maybe you just can't use occasionally. Another theme, another kind of statement that I hear over and over and over again is that life is just not going to be fun without using. That you might think that you're going to be just a boring person, an old fuddy-duddy, and that you might really believe that you need to have your addiction, your compulsion, your bad habit in your life in order to be a fun person with an enjoyable life. You might be worried that you're going to turn into somebody that you don't like. Again, this is something I hear all the time. People tell me they're afraid they're going to be tight, rigid, a drag, a boring person. Another obstacle to recovery is that you might believe that you cannot make all of the necessary changes that you need to make in your life in order to be free of the addiction, to be free of the compulsion, to be free of the bad habit. It's just too much. You can't do all the things and get all the things you need to get in place in order to recover. Recovery is just simply too much work. Here's another key factor that gets in the way of freeing yourself from an addiction or compulsion. It's the belief that your cravings are going to be overwhelming. Now, that's the voice of fear. The next big slippery sign, or let me start that again. The next big obstacle to permanent recovery is secrecy. It's hiding. It's isolation. It's the belief that nobody has to know if you relapse. The next obstacle to recovery is really kind of a heartbreaking theme. It's one that I hear over and over again. It's the belief that, or let me start that again. Particularly heartbreaking belief that gets in the way of recovery is the worry that you have been so damaged that you just simply can't recover. When it comes to recovering from addictions, compulsions, and bad habits, there's something very important that you need to know about. It's called post-acute withdrawal symptoms. Sometimes people refer to it in the clinical world as PAWS. PAWS is something that can threaten your abstinence. It can throw you back into the cycle of relapse. Again, that's a cycle that's very predictable. And basically, post-acute withdrawal symptoms threatens your abstinence because it's a point where you start to become very distressed. So, for example, what I've seen in my clients is they start to have mood swings. They start to feel a sense of anxiety, fear, irritability. There's a variable energy in their whole body mind system. They go up, they go down, they feel exhausted, they feel excited and energized, and their concentration starts to get very bouncy. It starts to get all over the place. Sometimes there's low enthusiasm. They just feel flat. They tell me they're just anhedonic. They're just not enjoying things. And a key sign is they start reporting sleep problems. They start oversleeping or undersleeping, or their sleep is all over the place. Here are some rules that are key when it comes to managing post-acute withdrawal symptoms. Let's cut through all the details here and look at the big picture. The important message is that it's time for you to change your life. You don't want to just be rearranging the decks on the Titanic, to use an expression. You want to be just changing, putting everything on the table, doing what you need to do to beat your addiction, your compulsion, and your bad habit. Next, You have to make a commitment to be completely honest with yourself and with other people. This is particularly true of people that you're turning to for accountability, therapists, counselors, uh, accountability buddies. Addiction is fueled by lying. And I do not mean that in a judgmental way. I mean lying in the sense of just covering up, avoiding, obscuring, leaving things out, being dishonest with yourself. When it comes to anything that's on autopilot, like an addiction or a compulsion, we're prone towards distorting things. We're prone to, an example for you. Someone that I work with that's dealing with a food and an alcohol addiction just started telling me that instead of counting calories, they just were going to be a little bit looser with their plan because they didn't want to be a rigid person. Now, here's where this gets slippery. This person has quite a dangerous history of bulimia and anorexia. And so they, in their past, have spent years in a cycle of binging and purging, which has caused them, quite frankly, it's put them in a lot of medical danger. So it's no small thing when they start telling me that they're just no longer counting calories. They're just kind of winging it, right? And that's because over the time that I've known this person, they've been very prone to misperceive what's going on with their food consumption. That brings us to the next important rule. You want to be asking for help. You can't do this in isolation. Occasionally, I meet a person who tells me that they had an addiction or compulsion. They read a book, they read an article, they made a decision, and they were able to stop the behavior. And it was relatively easy for them to do that. Again, that is something that some people can do. But if you're really dealing with an addiction or compulsion, then you can't. You actually need help to do this. So ask for help. The next important rule or guideline, again, I want to just cut through all the details here. It's vital that you emphasize and you practice self-care. When I'm talking about practicing self-care, here's an important guideline for you. You want to take as much self-care as you need, but not more. Why do I say that? It's because sometimes I've worked with men and women who have addictions, and their addiction or their compulsion can actually make them kind of self-centered and selfish. And so they do some damage to their relationships. They damage their marriages, their friendships, their relationships with their family of origin, because they just get very focused on themselves. So again, the guideline here is take as much self-care as you need. Definitely do that, but not more, right? You don't want to be just using self-care as a way to flee from your life and your responsibilities. You don't want to be just trying to make the world go away so that you don't have to deal with it. Over the long haul, that's not something that's going to work. It can be a short-term solution, right? Sometimes we actually have to step back from our lives and prioritize taking on an addiction. But over the long haul, it's not going to serve you. Now, here's the next guideline or the next rule for you. You want to follow the established wisdom. You want to be wary of doing it your own special way. And I want to say a word about that. We are unique. We are all individuals. That's true. And what's also true, right? So you want to make some wise decisions. You want to be discerning here because you might need to adapt your recovery plan to your specific situations. That's wise. I can't tell you the number of people that I have worked with over the years that think that they are the exception, that that the guidelines, especially when it comes to the stages of relapse, that the guidelines don't apply to them, that they're different. And again, as I mentioned earlier, sometimes that's where the harm reduction ideology can really backfire and keep people stuck in this endless cycle of relapse. Now I've got some reflection questions for you because I want you to learn from your personal cycle of relapse. I want you to be able to move forward and get traction in your life. So, the first thing I want you to ask yourself is what can you learn from this relapse experience? So, for example, are there new insights that you have about your triggers? Do you have a new understanding of the behaviors that lead to your use? Do you have a better sense of what you actually need? If you're reflecting well on this relapse, then you're going to have answers to those questions. It's important that you think about what strategies, what tools are going to help you to prevent your future relapse. So, for example, what specific behavioral coping mechanisms are you going to do? When are you going to do them? How are you going to put some distance, put some time and space between you and your specific triggers? How are you going to get consistent support and accountability? Here's another important thing that I want you to reflect on, particularly if you're dealing with the stage one mental relapse. How are you going to have some fun? What are you going to do to enjoy your life? He- Now, aside from fun, it's also important that you think about how you're how you're going to become more comfortable with discomfort. What are you going to do? Because that's something, those coping skills are essential to develop in yourself. If you're going to be free from self-medication of whatever you're doing, what specific steps can you take to rebuild trust in yourself and other people? And how can you repair any damage that's been caused by the relapse? I want you to reflect on the support that you have and the accountability that you have. Who are you reaching out to for support? How often are you doing that? How rigorous are you about that? Do you have a sponsor? Do you have a therapist? Do you have a coach, a trusted friend, a clergy member? Are you attending a support group in which you go and engage and speak up and do the work at every single meeting? What changes are there, if any, that you'd like to make in your work with your therapist or with your support network? What is one action that you can take today, right now, today to prioritize your recovery? How can you bump it up on your priority list? And now a reflection statement. I want you to write a brief reflection summarizing everything you've learned from this relapse and how you plan to move forward. It's important to remember relapse is not a failure. It's an opportunity to refine your life. It's an opportunity to learn and to grow. I want you to be kind to yourself as you work through your process. Thank you so much for your time and your attention. Thanks for listening today. I'd like to invite you to view my free class. It's called How to Kick the Habit Forever. In it, we talk about what you have to do in order to unhook yourself from compulsively using adult content. Go to www.kickthehabitforever.com now to view it.